So it's January 16th, 2025. Tonight we're going to do an article. We're going to read through an article. The very next chapter that we do in the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch is going to be on Tzitzit. So on your Talit, four corners, you have Tzitzit. And biblically, there should be blue in the Tzitzit. So there are two potential sources of that blue that have been debated in recent times. And we're going to cover an article based on that. Now, just so you know what we're talking about here, this is a picture of the cuttlefish. It's some type of like squid, it has like the 8 tentacles. And this is Murex trunculus. It's like a sea snail. So these are the two potential sources of Techeilet that are debated. I'm going to have a link to the article that I'm reading from in the description. I'm also going to have links to a playlist. Daniel Gladstein, Rabbi Daniel Gladstein, he has covered an enormous amount of halakhic material related to Techeilet. So I'll try to get you linked to that playlist, and as well as maybe some other videos. Now, the thing is, it's had a resurgence. Techeilet has had a resurgence in recent time. There are two groups. There are typically the Breslevers who have the Ratzinger Techeilet. Let's see. I don't know if you can see that right there. The Ratzinger. And there's also the group that wears Murex trunculus dye of Techeilet. Okay. And then there's people in between. I don't have it. I have it in a package, but I don't have it. I don't wear it. They are there's the opinion that because we don't know, we still don't use it because we don't know exactly what the source is. But in the future, it's anticipated that it will come to be known, and it won't be a debate anymore. So, and Daniel Gladstein, Rabbi Daniel Gladstein, he pretty much holds that opinion. And then there are some rabbis you'll see online, they actually wear Techeilet. Rav Dror, Rabbi David Bar Chaim, Rabbi Alon Anava. I've seen all three of those with Techeilet. I don't know exactly what they wear. I can assume what they wear. I believe Rabbi David Bar Chaim, he's a proponent, or at least he was, of Murex trunculus, the sea snail. Personally, this article is in favor of the cuttlefish, and that's my position. I think it's probably the cuttlefish. But we'll take a look at some of this stuff. So this article is called Understanding the Criteria for the Chilazon by Mendel E. Singer, PhD. This article was originally appeared in the Rabbi Jacob Yosef School-sponsored journal, the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society, Volume 40, Sukkot, 2001. Reprinted with permission. That's what it says, reprinted with permission. Mendel Singer, at the point of writing this, he was an assistant professor, School of Medicine, Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, background. The Torah commands us to wear a thread of blue, which is Techeilet, in each corner of our tzitzit. While tzitzit serves as a reminder to do the mitzvot, and this is in Numbers 15:38. The blue thread reminds us of Hashem. Techeilet resembles the color of the sea the sky, and the sky the throne of glory. The Gemara informs us that the Techeilet dye comes from a bodily fluid, literally blood, okay, of the Chilazon. At some point, it becomes forgotten which species is the Chilazon. Exactly when Techeilet ceased to exist is unknown, though some have suggested that this happened sometime between 5 and 700 CE. There is evidence that Techeilet continued to be dyed in some places for another several hundred years. So, as far as the Chilazon has two bloods, one that is its lifeblood and another that is stored in its own sac, okay? This other blood is the source of Techeilet dye, according to Rabbeinu Tam, Tosafot, Shabbat 75a, okay? The Ratzinger Rebbe bases his idea on the fact that the Geonim did not write about Techeilet that were no longer applicable, so that it was around like 500, 700 CE. Two of the Geonim, that would be Rav Netrone Gaon and Rav Shmuel Bar Hofni. They didn't write about laws that were not applicable in their day. So he says that if they were writing about this, then it still existed. So he also notes that the Rambam explained in a responsum the practical application of the laws of Techeilet, implying that they were wearing Techeilet in Luniel, a city called Luniel, because apparently someone from that city had wrote to them. So Luniel. Let's see. In the 1880s, Rabbi Gershon Hanoch Lehner, the Ratzinger Rebbe, set out to identify the Chilazon species. Although widely known for his Talmudic expertise, he had studied biology, chemistry, and engineering, and practiced medicine as well. It should be pointed out that I believe he specifically prayed that he would find the source of Techeilet. He made it his life mission, his spiritual mission in life, to find the Chilazon, to find out what it was. Guided by the simanim, the signs provided by the Talmud and the Rishonim, he traveled across Europe, studying at the famed aquarium of Naples. He decided that the long-lost Chilazon is Sepia officinalis, the common cuttlefish, believed by some to be the opinion of Rambam. He wrote 3 books on Techeilet comprising nearly 500 pages. That's a lot of material to write on that. In the words of one of his present-day dissenters, these books still stand as the definitive works on the subject and form the halakhic foundation of any discussion of the topic. Even today, Radzing produces Techeilet from the cuttlefish. I mean, I believe I've tried to find his book, and it's enormously costly. It's a rare book. But it's costly. Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Herzog, a brilliant Talmudist, Jewish historian and chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael from 1936 to 1959, was fluent in numerous languages, and Techeilet was the subject of much of his doctoral dissertation. Rabbi Herzog rejected the Ratzinger Rebbe's position of the cuttlefish and concluded the Chilazon was a member of the Yanthia species. However, the dye produced by the Yanthina turned brown and was not permanent. It appears that Rabbi Herzog did not pursue this matter further, and no Techeilet was ever produced from the Yanthina. In recent years, there's been some movement in favor of the Murex trunculus snail as the Chilazon. So this one here. Fueled by the work of Dr. Irving Zinderman, an academic scientist at the Israel Fiber Institute, followers of this theory formed an organization, Patil Techeilet Foundation, based largely on archaeological and scientific evidence. They have been active in publishing, lecturing, and electronic dissemination. So I think they do seminars and stuff like that. Their work has, for the most part, gone without critical appraisal. This article, this is 2001, this article will attempt to elucidate the criteria for identification of the Chilazon, clarify what is required to meet these criteria, and then evaluate the theory that Murex trunculus was the Chilazon. The criteria will be presented in 4 categories. The first section will discuss the primary criteria based on the statements brought by the Gemara for the purpose of describing the Chilazon. This is followed by an analysis of the Gemara's chemical test for Techeilet. And the secondary criteria will deal with those characteristics of the Chilazon which can be deduced from statements made for other purposes. Lastly, there's a section for other evidence which might be brought to lend further credence to or discredit a claim. So the primary criteria. The strongest criteria for identifying the Chilazon comes from the Gemara Menachot, where the subject of Techeilet is discussed extensively. So this is Menachot 41 to 44. There, the Talmud cites several sources in order to describe the Chilazon. These statements are of the utmost importance because they were cited for the sole purpose of describing the Chilazon. So we also have to ask the question, why did Hashem want us to use one specific creature for the dye? So there has to be something about that creature that is the reason why Hashem wants us to use it, right? Chazal, knowing which species was the Chilazon, chose these statements to describe it. As such, in order for a candidate species to satisfy these criteria, it is not sufficient to meet these criteria in a minimalist sense. It must be reasonable that Chazal, our sages, would have chosen these statements to describe it. In evaluating whether a particular species is the Chilazon, a strong case must be made for all the primary criteria. The primary criteria for the Chilazon come from the following statements. So basically, the color of its body is like the sea. Its form is like a fish. It comes up once in 70 years. Its blood is used for Techeilet, and therefore it is expensive. So, as Rabbi Herzog points out, the first requirement uses the Lashon Gufo, meaning body or flesh. So it does not, so it's the color of its Gufo, its body or goof, is like the sea. It does not refer to the shell, which is usually rendered nartik or klipa. So the Lashon here, the language here, gufo domeh layam, Techeilet domeh layam, where it is understood that the color of Techeilet is similar to the color of the sea. There, the comparison is extended to the sky and the sapphire, indicating that Techeilet is blue. If just a few lines apart, dealing with the same subject, we find the same expression, domeh layam, it is reasonable to conclude that the meaning is the same in both cases. If Techeilet and the body of the Chilazon are both domeh layam, then the color of Techeilet and the color of the body of the Chilazon must be similar. That is, both blue. This is supported by the Lashon, or the language, of the Baraita of Tzitzit, which states, Gufo domeh l'rakia. The body of the murex does not resemble the sea. The Patil group, the Patil Techeilet group, argues that the shell of the murex trunculus is sometimes covered with a sea fouling. So this would have some sort of sea fouling on it. The color of these organisms will vary from place to place, but is sometimes blue or green. This argument fails on 3 counts. First, the requirement is for the body, not the shell. Second, the color of the sea fouling is only sometimes blue. Since it is usually not blue, the Gemara certainly would not choose to describe it as blue. Third, it is implausible that Chazal, or sages, would choose to identify the murex trunculus by giving the description of the sea fouling, which is neither a part of the creature nor distinctive, since it covers everything else in the area as well. Some have tried to argue that the Hebrew word yam can also mean seabed. So like we talk about Yam Suf, but they crossed on the bed of the sea, right? So we crossed the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf, and they say, well, the sea split and we crossed on the seabed, right? However, the only shell is colored like the seabed, not the body. Considering that Yam almost always means sea and is used as such in regards to the color of Techeilet in many places, it is hard to believe that it could be used to mean seabed here. In fact, the requirement that the color of the body of the Chilazon be like the Yam is just a few lines after the Gemara's statement that Techeilet is the color of Yam, which everyone, including murex supporters, agree means sea. Okay. As for criteria 2, which is its form is like a fish, the statement of the Gemara is briato domeh l'dam. Briato means its form, as explained by Rashi and Rabbeinu Gershom. Okay, murex trunculus in no way resembles a fish. No, we don't think of fish when we think of that. Supporters of the murex trunculus theory suggest briato could mean its creation, since murex spawn like fish. Aside from relying on an interpretation of briato that is contrary to the classical Mefarshim, there is another difficulty. Since most mollusks spawn, it is unlikely that Chazal would have chosen this characteristic to distinguish the Chilazon from other species. Regarding criteria 3, which is it comes up once in 70 years and its blood is used for Techeilet, the Ratzinger Rebbe says this means that there are times when the Chilazon is abundant. Likewise, Rabbi Herzog, citing also the Baraita of Tzitzit, says that Chilazon come up every 7 years, is of the opinion that there should be some cycle, though not necessarily 7 or 70. Murex trunculus has no known cycle or times of unusual abundance. Patil Techeilet Foundation followers have tried to argue that the Hebrew Shva Shanim in the Baraita could also mean sevenfold. And Pliny the Elder mentions an optimal 7-month cycle for harvesting murex snails. This not only ignores the Gemara's expression of 70 years, but also assumes that sevenfold means 7 1-month periods. They do not suggest a reason why the base unit should be 1 month. Clearly, the intention of the Gemara and the Baraita is that it is unusual for there to be an abundance, and every 7 months, it's hardly unusual or noteworthy. Purple dye from all species of murex, including trunculus, was exceedingly expensive. So, in truth, this was used for dye. It was used for purple. It was used for royal purple and used by kings and other stuff like that. So that's historically what we know it has been used for. This was because each snail possessed so little dye that it took about 8,000 snails to make 1 gram of dye. I mean, look at this. This is in someone's hand. I think that picture of that hand is maybe about the size of mine. So that would be like maybe not even 3 inches long, maybe 3 inches long, maybe a little smaller, depending on where you get them. 8,000 snails to make 1 gram of dye. that's got to be incredibly expensive, because it would take a lot to transport all those, it'd take a lot to collect all those, right? And criteria number 4, that it's expensive, Rashi explains that the Techeilet dye was expensive because of the Chilazon's rare appearance, and not because of the minute dye quantity. That's what Rashi says. This follows from the language of the Gemara, where the statement that the dye is expensive is introduced with the word lefichach. Therefore, in the preceding statement was about the once in 70-year appearance of the Chilazon. Rabbi Herzog indicates that this requirement implies that the quantity of dye in the Chilazon was not very small, which is inconsistent with the Murex trunculus. Okay, chemical test. In ancient times, there were unscrupulous individuals who would substitute an imitation Techeilet known as Chilazon, okay, for the real Techeilet. Chilazon is widely understood to be indigo, traditionally derived from a plant. Indigo was the predominant source of blue dye in ancient times and was both readily available and relatively inexpensive. This counterfeit Techeilet was virtually identical to the color of the real Techeilet. Accordingly, the rabbis proposed chemical tests that could distinguish between the chemical that made up the authentic Techeilet and the chemical that made up the counterfeit Techeilet. These tests are based on subjecting the dyed wool to a fermentation process and ruling if Chilazon if the color worsens. The fermentation processes were used in the traditional method of dyeing indigo and caused the blue indigo to change to a yellow solution. Chazal used this knowledge to design tests that indigo would fail. The chemical test proposed by Rav Yitzhak and the son of Rav Yehuda describes a fermentation vat typically of what was used in ancient dyeing of indigo. The main ingredient was fermented urine, mei raglaim, and although the Gemara's lashon, or language of ben arba'im yom, could mean the mei raglaim, the urine, had to be 40 days old, thereby sufficiently fermented. Or it could mean the mei raglaim had to be from someone 40 days old, as Rashi notes. So the mei raglaim must be fermented. Mei raglaim, urine of babies under 6 weeks old, consists mostly of water, making it a poor choice for fermentation. Thus, the Gemara's use of ben arba'im yom could reasonably be understood either way. Regardless, it is clear that the Gemara's chemical tests were based on the chemical properties of indigo and were designed so that indigo would fail the test. The Patil group uses mucus from the Murex trunculus snail, and through a process creates indigo, chemically identical to plant indigo. In other words, Patil is saying that real Techeilet and imitation Techeilet are the same chemical, just made from different sources. This position is untenable. Obviously, if the Gemara gives chemical tests to distinguish Techeilet from Chilazon, they cannot be the same chemical. I don't see that that's a problem, but this is his position. Dr. Alan Croft, a retired professor of pigment chemistry familiar with the Patil dyeing process, writes in a personal communication, there should absolutely be no chemical difference between plant and small indigo. Thus, any chemical test that posits a difference is not valid, in my opinion. Therefore, the Gemara's chemical test cannot possibly be testing plant indigo versus snail indigo. I mean, but the idea is that the chemical test, if they're doing a chemical test, then, it should be different. This leaves two possibilities. Plant indigo is not Chilazon, or snail indigo is not Techeilet. Given the wide acceptance of indigo as Chilazon, and the corroboration afforded by the Gemara's tests, which are clearly based on detecting indigo, the only conclusion would seem to be that Techeilet is not snail indigo. Nonetheless, Dr. Roald Hoffman, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, does reach a different conclusion. Recognizing the impossibility of distinguishing plant indigo from snail indigo, he clings to the conclusion that Murex indigo is Techeilet. He writes of the Gemara's chemical test, these tests don't work because the chemical is the same. Since the Gemara's tests were clearly based on sound scientific knowledge and the tests were actually used, Rav Yitzhak, the son of Rav Yehuda, used this test to test it thus, it would seem rather presumptuous to doubt the veracity of the Gemara's test. It is the scientist's conclusion that Murex indigo is Techeilet that needs to be re-examined. Even Dr. Irving Zinderman himself, the chemist whose work led to the creation of the Patil group, acknowledges that Murex indigo is guaranteed to fail the Gemara's chemical test and therefore rejects the theory of Murex indigo as genuine Techeilet. Patil writings have suggested that the chemical test might be designed to detect impurities that might be found in plant indigo but are not found in snail indigo. This logic demonstrates a lack of understanding of the nature of the chemical test. It is clear from the above discussion that the Gemara's tests are based on the chemical nature of indigo and not any remaining impurities. Thus, Murex indigo used by Patil for Techeilet will fail the Gemara's test, rendering it invalid. However, a distinction must be made between evaluating whether a species is the Chilazon and assessing whether a particular dye is Techeilet. Even though Murex indigo cannot be genuine Techeilet, this does not by itself preclude the possibility that Murex trunculus is the Chilazon. There may be as of yet undiscovered alternative process that creates a different blue dye that is not indigo from the Murex trunculus. Therefore, it is still necessary to evaluate whether Murex trunculus meets the criteria for the Chilazon. An interesting side note, the process used by the Patil to make indigo from Murex trunculus would also work for the other species famous for their use in ancient purple dyeing, Murex brandaris and Purpura hemastoma. Indeed, none of the arguments presented in Patil writings appear to uniquely identify Murex trunculus. Secondary criteria. There are other sources from which additional information about the Chilazon may be deduced. These criteria can lend valuable support to a theory postulating a particular species as the Chilazon. However, care should be taken in determining the weight placed on these criteria. These criteria were not brought for the purpose of identifying the Chilazon, as was the case with the primary criteria discussed above. As such, it may be that a particular statement should not be understood literally or exactly. Unlike the primary criteria, meeting secondary criteria should only involve a plausible explanation and does not have to bring out the uniqueness of the Chilazon. It may be difficult to understand without already being familiar with the species. There is also the complication that it is not always clear when the Gemara's use of the word Chilazon is speaking specifically of the Chilazon's shell Techeilet, Techeilet. In some of these cases, the classical Mefarshim clarify this. In other cases, it remains ambiguous. Shell grows with it. The Midrash says about the Chilazon, its shell, or nartiko, grows with it. This would rule out hermit crabs, for example, since they do not grow shells, but rather move into shells they find. This would also rule out species like the lobster that when outgrowing their shell, they discard it and grow another. Elsewhere, the Midrash Rabbah says when it grows, its malvush grows with it. So malvush is kind of like, malvush, a garment, would appear to be some form of growth on the exterior of the Chilazon. The term malvush, garment, seems to imply that it is not merely attached but covers the body of the Chilazon or surrounds it. Murex trunculus has a shell of its own but doesn't seem to have anything else that could be termed malvush. It may be that the Midrash is using malvush as a synonym for shell. This would make sense in the context of Midrash, which discusses the issue of whether the Jews in the desert outgrew their clothes. The Chilazon is brought as an example to suggest that the clothes grew with the wearer. So, as you can see, there's already this idea of, okay, how do we interpret this in essence of like the whole idea that, you're to remember the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. So this creature is connected with whatever this creature is connected with the Exodus from Egypt. It's connected with the Torah, right? So referring to the shell as malvush, garment, would be inconsistent with the context. Based on this understanding of the malvush, Murex trunculus would appear to meet this criterion. Hard shell. To tell you the truth, it almost seems like it would be easier to say that the snail lives in a house rather than a garment. But anyway, hard shell. The Gemara discusses the case of someone who extracts the dye from the Chilazon on Shabbat. The verb used by the Gemara in describing the action of a person extracting the dye is potsea. Potsea is usually understood to mean to crush or crack open. This would imply that the Chilazon had a hard shell, though this could be an external or an internal shell. Rashi says that the person squeezes the Chilazon in his hand to get out the blood, the dye secretion. From Rashi's comment, we can only infer that squeezing the Chilazon can make the dye come out. Rashi's use of the word squeeze is difficult to understand since it seems to imply a soft substance, not a hard shell. This difficulty in understanding Rashi might be resolved if the Chilazon, while being held in the hand, has a shell on one side and flesh on the other. Thus, the person squeezes the fleshy side of the Chilazon, and in the process may crack open or crush the hard shell on the other side. Murex trunculus has a hard external shell that is cracked in order to get the dye out. The shell almost completely encloses the body. This would be consistent with the usual understanding of potzea, but not with Rashi's word dochek, I think, for squeezing. Dye is better while Chilazon is alive. We learn in the Gemara that people try not to kill the Chilazon when extracting the dye because the dye is better if extracted while the Chilazon is alive. From this Gemara, we learn that there is sufficient difference in the dye when extracted while the Chilazon is alive and when it is extracted just moments after its death. Patil followers argue that the murex secretion, the mucus, loses its dyeing power a few hours after the shell's death. This doesn't help since the Gemara is speaking not of a few hours, but mere moments after death. Another problem is Pilny's statement that the murex discharges its dye upon death. If so, the reason not to kill the murex when removing the gland containing the dye is because otherwise the precious few drops of dye will be lost. So hidden in the sand. The Gemara in Megillah states that the verse in Devarim, Deuteronomy 33:19, hidden treasures of the sand, refers to the Chilazon shel Techeilet. It is not clear how restrictive this criterion is. It might only mean that the Chilazon is considered to be a creature of the sand and that it is hidden. In this case, it would seem to be sufficient to be hidden by its own shell and that it would not be necessary to bury itself in the sand. On the other hand, it might mean that it is hidden because it is buried in the sand. This is understanding of the Ratzinger Rebbe, citing the Sefer HaKahana, Hilchot Tzitzit, as stating that the Chilazon buries itself in the sand with its head sticking out. The murex trunculus lives on the sand and simply by virtue of hiding its body in its shell could be considered hidden. There are times when it buries itself in the seabed, which might when it might satisfy the general requirement of burying itself in the sand. Given that this is a secondary criterion, murex trunculus would seem to reasonably meet this criterion, though not in the manner described by Sefer Hakana. The Keller of the Blood. Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, states that the blood of the Chilazon shel Techeilet is black like ink. Rashi states that the appearance of the blood of the Chilazon shel Techeilet is like the Keller of Techeilet. The Ratzinger Rebbe reconciles the apparent contradiction between Rashi and Rambam by explaining that when Rashi says Maris Damo, appearance of its blood, he's referring to the blood after it is prepared for dyeing, while Rambam refers to the original Keller of the blood. Supporters of the murex theory, the snail, followed the lead of Rabbi Herzog, who, unable to find a source to support Rambam's statement, speculated that Rambam was basing this on an erroneous statement of Aristotle and dismissed the statement of Rambam. However, it is not clear that the Patil Techeilet group's Techeilet meets the criterion of Rashi either. So the guys that think it's a snail, okay? The murex secretion is essentially clear. Left in the sun, it turns purple-blue. When it is placed in a chemical solution, it turns yellow. It is then exposed to ultraviolet radiation, after which the wool threads are dipped in the solution. The wool turns blue when it is removed from the solution and exposed to the air. Thus, the murex trunculus dye is never blue as a liquid, only turning blue after it is already on the garment. This might be reconciled by saying that when Rashi refers to the appearance of the blood of the Chilazon, he means the dye as it appears on the tzitzit after the dyeing is completed. But that's kind of silly because that's the name. We're saying it's Techeilet, right? So how does he say it's the Keller of Techeilet? As a secondary criterion, this would seem to be an acceptable explanation of Rashi, although there is still a problem of dismissing the Rambam on the matter of the science. And Rambam was, he was a physician. He was one of the greatest physicians in all of history. So he should have known something. Treatment for hemorrhoids. The Gemara also tells us that the Chilazon was used to treat hemorrhoids. Rabbi Herzog states that modern pharmaceutics knows nothing of the use of a mollusk to treat hemorrhoids. Rabbi Herzog's comments are a bit puzzling. Given that this treatment was from the times of the Gemara, it would be likely that the mention of this would be found now only in a non-traditional medical sources, what might be deemed today to be alternative medicine. Additionally, the Ratzinger Rebbe had already written that cuttlefish ink had been used as a treatment for hemorrhoids since ancient times. Indeed, it is still sold today for this purpose. As for murex trunculus, in ancient times it was considered to be bad for bowels, the snail. So this was used in ancient times for hemorrhoids, and this is bad for your bowels. So tentacles bent like hooks. The Mishnah describes a chain hanging on the wall with something called a Chilazon attached to the head of the chain. The Mefarshim say it was used. It was called this because it was shaped like the Chilazon shell Techeilet. And Tiferet Yisrael explicitly states that this was an iron hook attached at the end, which was used to hang the chain on a wall. The Ratzinger Rebbe understands this to mean the Chilazon has long tentacles that are bent like hooks. No part of a murex snail would fit this description. So it's easy to believe that the tentacles on a cuttlefish could resemble a hook, whereas this doesn't have anything that resembles a hook. Snake-like extensions. The Gemara speaks of red, flesh-like warts forming a snake-like shape in the eye. This disease is called both snake and Chilazon. The Ratzinger Rebbe states that the Chilazon must have snake-like limbs or extensions and have red warts. This description does not fit murex trunculus. Other evidence. Aside from establishing criteria to identify Chilazon, it may be possible to find evidence to corroborate an opinion regarding the identity of the Chilazon. The following paragraphs discuss this type of evidence in the context of the murex trunculus theory. Archaeological evidence. There can be little doubt that murex trunculus was used in ancient dyeing. It has long been accepted that murex trunculus was used for dyeing purple in ancient times. There is significant archaeological evidence to support this. However, all of the evidence suggests that it was used for purple dyeing. There is absolutely no evidence to support that murex trunculus was used to dye blue. In fact, Dr. Zitterman himself points out it would be absurd to think that non-Jews would use murex to make indigo blue when they could make the same thing easier and cheaper using plants, as was done all over the world. One might argue that murex indigo was used to make Techeilet, while the identical but inexpensive plant indigo was used for all other blue dyeing. However, piles of murex trunculus shells have been found at many ancient dyeing sites, not just in the vicinity of the Jews. Certainly at those other sites that would only have used murex trunculus for purple. The notion that murex trunculus was used for making indigo is both illogical and groundless. Let us examine the archaeological evidence. Mounds of murex trunculus shells, as well as two related species, murex brandaris and purpura hemastoma, have been found at ancient dyeing sites in many locations. These shells were cracked in the exact spot to get the dye. This is solid proof that murex trunculus was used in ancient dyeing, but it does not imply that it was used for dyeing blue. The 13th century BCE potsherd from Sarepta has a stripe of dye that is believed to be from the murex trunculus. It is a purple stripe with no detectable blue indigo content. A vat from a dig at Tel Shikmona has purple murex dye on it, not blue as previously described in a brochure from the Patil Techeilet Foundation. From the picture, it is obviously purple, but the text erroneously said blue. Pilny, so I think it's Pilny the Elder, speaks in great depth about dyeing with murex. Different shades of purple, red and violet, but not blue. Patil followers point out that at one site, the shells of murex brandaris and purpura hemastoma were together, but the murex trunculus shells were in a different area. They leap to the conclusion that murex trunculus must have been used for dyeing blue. They are ignoring Pilny, among others, who states that the famed Tyrian purple shade was produced by double dyeing with murex brandaris and purpura hemastoma. Thus, it was illogical that those two species were found together, and apart from murex trunculus, how does that suggest murex trunculus was used for dyeing blue? In fact, it is hard to see how chemical analysis of archaeological finds could ever support the idea that murex trunculus was used for dyeing blue. If the chemical was purely indigo, the natural assumption would be that the source was plant indigo, which was used around the world. If indigo was found with traces of purple,